You are all heroes for staying. The attention span it requires today to do this is very different. And back in those days, films like this one, 90-minute films, were the norm. Today, I mean, this is kind of rare for documentaries. I am very excited to be here. This is actually much more than a film screening. It's also a reunion. Some of us haven't seen each other for quite some time, and unfortunately, I am not sure if our fifth filmmaker is going to be able to join us because no, she has a family emergency and she apologized. She was going to try to join us over Zoom, but it doesn't look like she's available. That's Maya Migdashi. I would like to have my colleagues just share a few words for just a couple minutes, and then we will just open up the floor. And I would like to start with, let's start with Adam and go this way, because I've talked too much today.
Hello. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you for sitting through all of that. It's been a while since I watched it, and it brought back a flood of memories, as did a lot of the coverage of the 20th anniversary that's been airing in some places and you can watch online. I don't really know what to say other than, I remember when we came back and started doing screenings of the film, we would show it in rooms like this, and sometimes nicer rooms, and sometimes theaters. And I remember thinking, people are sitting comfortably in comfortable chairs, in air conditioning, in heat, whatever. And you could see it to some extent, but the sensation of being in Baghdad in the summer without electricity, with the air quality being horrible due to the effects of the war and the lack of electricity and the lack of sanitation and all of that. I always felt that that was something that we weren't able to reproduce for the viewers, for the audiences to experience, and that having that element of an experience, of a sensory experience of what it was like, was something that film just can't ever really capture, and it's unfortunate because I think that was something that's part of the experience that I will always remember, and how it affected us so much in terms of our ability to film, in terms of engaging with people. It's part of the, it affects how people are handling the situation, and so it was really tough. From a political perspective, after this film, years later, a couple of years later, I ended up going and working in Afghanistan for a year. And I've been actually more involved in Afghanistan than I've been in Iraq since then. But one thing I think that was common, and I didn't realize it when we were in Iraq as much, but people in Afghanistan, and I think in Iraq also, expected that the United States, when it came in, had a plan, that had an idea, even if it was something that they didn't like, even if it was to loot the country, even if it was, some of the things we heard, that there was a plan. And I think what we've seen with both of these countries, and for me most painfully with what's happened in the last 2 years in Afghanistan, is that we didn't have a plan. We had no business having a plan to go into these countries in the first place, but once we went there, as Colin Powell once wrote, and then abandoned his own famous doctrine of if you break it, you own it. He apparently didn't think we had to own this one. But the effect of not having a coherent, organized plan for doing the basics is in some ways, I think, the biggest part of the criminality of the whole thing. And I think that's something that's hard to document and hard to hold anyone accountable. But it is important that we keep talking about this even 20 years later, because I do think we need to keep striving for some measure of accountability. And I'll just make one other point, because it didn't come, we experienced this while we were there, but we didn't get into it very much. One of the reasons why we went to make the film was because we wanted to give a platform for Iraqi voices. And I think Sana will talk more about that. Because our media was so bad in doing any of that. And it wasn't just that it was an American media and had no access to Iraqis. It's that they went and embedded themselves with the military and not just sold the American public the war beforehand, but continued to sell it and portray it a certain way. And you heard a little bit from Iraqis. They had some idea about this, but nowhere near the extent. And so the media complicity, which continues to this day in lots of places, is something that I don't think has ever truly been reckoned with effectively. And that was one of the motivations that we had for this little contribution that we can make to trying to change that narrative. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
I've seen it a little bit here and there. We actually had a showing at the PS1 MoMA a couple years ago, right before COVID, but I haven't watched it since then. And it's powerful to rewatch, to think 20 years ago we went in and did this, how absolutely crazy that was that we did that. And yet we were more organized than the Americans were, which is also insane. And we noticed that the minute we drove to like a fake border when we were driving from Jordan, did you remember that? And we said, hey, we're trying to go in. We didn't know what we were doing, even though we knew more. And they just were like, come on in. It was such a surreal experience. The entire thing was really surreal. And it was life-shaping for me, for sure, and it was really an honor to do it with these folks, and to be able to be a part of returning, obviously, to a tragic situation, but to see it through Sinan's eyes as well, which was incredibly powerful. We couldn't have done it without him. With his connections, with his love of the country, with the connections to the people and the land and all the things that I especially was very disconnected from. And it was just incredibly powerful. And to see, I'm watching this, and I don't speak Arabic, unfortunately. I mean, here and there, but nothing. And still 20 years later, even though I tried. And I remember their faces. They're etched in my memory. And so each time I see their faces, it's like, I'm wondering how they are now, 20 years later. Obviously, I don't think we have, maybe with your friends, we have connections with them. But there's so many people, even those American soldiers who were pretty much 100% oblivious. And when we were talking to them then, they also thought and believed in that moment. Of course, it was 3 months in. So I wondered now, if we found them, what they thought, or if we found the Iraqis who we spoke to then, where are they now? What do they think? That cab driver, the folks in the hospital, did any of those babies live? Like, that's all I kept thinking, rewatching it, and wondering what has become of them. Like, we know politically, from a large distance what has happened, obviously, but for those individuals that we were able to connect with, I wonder.
When we came back, this was a truly team effort, and it was such a guerrilla operation, because with very, very limited means. And it's very important also for the post-production. We all put in our efforts, but Bassam is very humble, but Bassam with the post-production was very difficult. And if you see, I don't know what we called the studio, there is no studio. It was Dirar Hakim, our friend's apartment, who was donated that place for it to be editing room. And then the Haddad household, as I said before the film, and all the support. But I want to say that one discussion we had when we came back was that how do we make sure that this film will endure? And if I may say so, I said you can count on most of the films that are going to come out about Iraq are not going to be about Iraqis. So our film, I'm proud to say, is still one of very few films about Iraqi civilians, which is part of the larger problem of how, as I said in my thing this morning about how this country looks at Iraq or at itself, that the Iraqi civilians don't matter, and that by and large the victims of the war in this country are the soldiers, and they are the victims in a way, but they're not the primary victims. But
that's it. Actually, let me just also say that we recruited a filmmaker from Lebanon who's an editor who flew here, and we were at this apartment for 30 days. It was Maya Magdashi, myself, and Carol Mansour, who is now perhaps the premier documentarian in Lebanon and far beyond. And we had to finish within a month, and that's unfortunate that Maya is not here today. Let me just say, I mean, there's a lot, and we're going to talk about whatever you would like to address, but let me just say something a bit more, I guess, analytical, because it is what you saw in the film throughout, and that is the juxtaposition of how we, as well as so many people in the film, most people, and we actually were very fair in demonstrating or showing or representing all the views we saw. We did not actually play quote-unquote politics. We showed what we saw, irrespective of where we stood. Now, the very interesting part of this film and this whole project was how we were trying to navigate, how we were all both opposed to Saddam Hussein for a long time, as we are to all authoritarian regimes in the region, and at the same time opposed to the invasion, basically a manifestation of US policy in the region. And it was not easy to navigate both, but you notice that the Iraqis, who are not studying this like we are, have been actually even more eloquent than we were, and we still are, and we are more eloquent than we are now in addressing this juxtaposition, how they were navigating these two. Interestingly, we are now, in 20 years later, or 19 years later, because we started a year and a half ago, we have a project. It's a closed workshop project, which is going to come to fruition and to the public eye this year. It's titled Navigating Anti-Authoritarianism and Anti-Imperialism, which is precisely what we are witnessing. It's also what happened in Syria, what happened in Iran, where peoples of the region are opposed to their repressive regimes, but they're also not going to support various sorts of imperial policies, interventions, and so on, which is kind of like the tension of the day, and it has been for some decades. And we wanted to bring that out because we saw that this is the position of so many people in Iraq, and that nuance was lost. Because if you are critiquing the war, people would assume that you're from the other side. If you're critiquing Saddam, it's assumed that you are like pro-invasion and so on and so forth. So this is what we also tried to show, and I hope that it came through. I was, and I was, and Sinan and I continuously talk about this experience. In fact, you know, we don't say this publicly, but I will out us. We actually repeat words and phrases from the film for the past 20 years ad nauseum on a daily basis, and sometimes we laugh, and sometimes it's in jest, and look, we're joking, and we feel that maybe that's not fair because this is a miserable situation, but it's become part of our everyday speak in so many ways, and watching it today was very wonderful. It was heavy, but it was very wonderful for us, and I'm happy that everyone was able to join. I think we can just take any questions or comments if people are willing to share. We have awesome people with microphones that can be shared with you.
He's coming with the mic.
Very moving film. Of course, you know, everybody that grew up through it realized the tragedy of the whole thing, and really, I'm still shocked. It was the greatest crime I've ever seen in my life, you know, to invade Iraq on baloney pretenses. And it's interesting because the whole like misplanning for the invasion was Rumsfeld's desire to test his smarter, lighter military things. Look, we can do it in only 100,000 people instead of 500,000 or something. And so they were all told not to police the state, not to stop any kind of looting. In fact, they somehow thought that it was part of liberation for the people to, you know, snap back against Saddam, but they were destroying the whole country. You know, and one of the things that I wonder if you'd talk about maybe seems the entire Ukrainian thing is blowback, long-term blowback, because Putin was about the only person in the world who believed Bush when he talked about weapons of mass destruction, and they signed off on the destruction of a 30-year client state, you know, of the Soviet Union, and that was where you turned completely bad, and even very specifically says it in his speeches when, you know, he had the whole Iraq, Ukraine invasion thing. And you know, I wonder if the whole, I mean, really, you know, it's like Iraq is a gift that keeps on giving. So do you want to talk about any of that?
Thank you. We'll take a few questions at a time, if that's possible. If there are any other, yes, good. We have a couple more.
Hi, thank you so much. This was such a moving film and so tragic to see. If you were to create a documentary about now in the 20 years past and the occupation by ISIS, for example, what do you think you would do from that, and what would have been the lessons from the last experience? And are there any other Iraqi perspectives, for example, Yazidi, Turkmen, that you would seek to highlight as well?
Thank you so much for this. As someone grew up through the wars and impacted by it, it was very heavy for me to watch, but because it was very real, I could remember all the things from the movie. I wanted to ask about, I'm taking an oral history and film documentary class with Mass, and I'm wondering about the creation of this documentary, especially with the field work. How did you navigate the access issues in this context? Because also like talking about very sensitive things at a very sensitive time. I am wondering, how did you navigate the access and the trust, build the trust with people to get all these clips? Thank you.
We have one more. The gentleman, I think and then we will answer, and then we'll wait for another round if there is one.
So I was born in 2000. I wasn't even really, I don't even think I was able to make memories when we invaded Iraq. And so I really wasn't as aware of the events that were happening then. So I was just curious, how much pushback did you really get for releasing this film? And were there any institutions that tried to either censor or downplay your film?
All right, thank you very much. Also, let's start with Adam and then come this way. You can pass on any of the questions, just answer what you'd like to address.
I'll sort of try to answer a couple of the questions about making the film and maybe like what we would look at 20 years later. Well, our plan for going was, let's go with Sinan. Let's film what we can, because we had no idea what we were getting, what it was going to be like on the ground and what we would have access to. And I'll come back to that point in a second. But I think we were surprised at first, to some extent, that when we would show up in a neighborhood and come out and start to just walk around in the street, people came up to us largely or would gather around us and want to speak. People very much wanted to speak, in part because there wasn't anybody soliciting their opinions, generally. Media journalists that we met with that were there. My wife's cousin was a CNN journalist. She was ensconced in the Palestine Hotel up on the roof and never came down to the street. So that was just, in some ways the question of access and trust was obliterated just simply by the fact that people wanted to be heard. And we were able to do that. And I think when we were doing it, this idea that this is only a snippet, of course, of what we ended up filming. We stayed and filmed as many people wanted to talk, in the street or wherever we were, in the cafe, and so we have a lot more than when we showed. I think we intentionally made a film that was mainly, we went to jail because we found out that memorial was happening. But otherwise, everything else was in the city. It was in Baghdad, and I think that was the sort of structure of sorts, the scope of like where we thought we could do something, because otherwise it becomes like way too complex to try to capture so many other elements of the country and the narratives. And doing anything to do justice to the experience of Iraqis of all the different ethnicities, religions, circumstances, cities, geographies, would be extremely, that's not something you could do in one film, I don't think. In terms of access, we did try to go, and I just want to mention this because it is so important. We did drive out to Abu Ghraib, because of course Sinan knew about Abu Ghraib as a place that was a prison that Saddam had used, and we thought we would go there, and I think we kind of thought that we would be able to just kind of walk in the way we were able to do pretty much everywhere else. But when we got there, there was a tower with soldiers up on top, and we were stopped by a jeep that came out to stop us. And we finally were able to make our way up to the main, one of the gates that would go into the compound. And all we could see from peering in was a lot of military weaponry, tanks and jeeps, and I think maybe even helicopters were in there. But they would not let us in. And I remember Sinan saying at the time, like, imagine what they're doing in there. And that was as close as we could get. And I think that's something we probably all, I don't know about regret, but that's one thing I think looking back, that had we been able to somehow get our way in there, that would have been huge.
I mean, I'll just talk about the structure and the documentary aspects of things. I think, we, like Adam said, we had some plan, but we really just kind of would drive a place, get out of the car, start filming. People would run up to us. And, we had endless hours of people talking about their trauma, right? Because people need to talk about their trauma. I mean, the entire country at that point, and now it's worse, but had complex PTSD that we were just receiving, right? So we were just filming them, acting as witness, validating them to some degree, and offering them a voice that they didn't have. And that was our main thrust. In terms of what we would have done now, I mean, just technologically, it would be a whole different film, right? I mean, forget it. Everyone could have their own story. We could narrate it themselves. They wouldn't just need us with a camera, right? It's a totally different power dynamic. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say, memory is interesting, right? Because we're there recording everyone's memory, and now I'm listening to you. I was like, I completely forgot that we did that, right? Like, that's pretty intense that we did that. A lot of things were intense, and there were moments where we were really vulnerable. We were like actually held up by gunpoint at some point. I mean, there was the stuff that we should have made a behind-the-scenes movie because it really was its own story. But yeah, that's sort of what I have to say about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't want to reinforce the sectarian outlook, and we had, ideally would have liked to have gone to Kurdistan and to the south, but we didn't have enough money to do that, frankly. We took money from our checking accounts as graduate students to do this. But the people you see in this film happen to be, as Bassam said, from different parts of the spectrum. Some were obviously come from Shiite backgrounds. Some were looking forward to the occupation in the jail and elsewhere. Some were from A'zamiyya, which suffered a lot. There were a couple of Kurds. We did go to one of the headquarters of the Kurdish parties, but they didn't want to talk to us. Ideally, the problem is the media in this country is so impoverished that it would take 15 or 30 films. We had to cover so much in our film because there was so much to cover. But we didn't want to put labels. And I just wanted to say that we intentionally, as we say in the beginning, wanted a non-linear fragmented films to push back against this notion of some kind of Hollywoodish simple story. And if PBS refused to show the film, that's the only place where we thought they might, because they thought it was fragmented and non-linear. Also, this is very important at this moment. People want to look back to San Francisco and New York and celebrate how some people were against the war. Yes, more than half of the country was for the war. And oftentimes, we showed this film in universities and some churches and community centers, but this film was seen as trying to, ruin the party and the happy story, because it was actually delivering the news that the occupation is not a happy story. And when we released our films, there was a film that was financed by the Navy that came out, Voices of Iraq, where supposedly they gave cameras to Iraqis to film themselves, but of course, propaganda. So this is what the film was coming against. If we were, we talked a couple of times about going back, but it would take so much money. And also we were lucky, as Adam said and as Bassam said, we went right after when people were really thirsty, because no one really bothered to talk to them. The journalists go to 2 places or 3 places. They never go around. They trusted us because we spoke the language, and they realized we were not an Arab satellite channel. We didn't come with anyone. We were really independent, and we knew their history. We knew what they were talking about, and that made it easy to talk to them. And one last thing I mentioned, in El Dijal, we ran out of tape. And people came and we told them, we don't have any more tape. They were like, it's okay, I just want to tell you my story, which says something about the importance, of course, of people wanting to tell someone else about what they'd gone through.
This is awesome. I'm not going to add anything. I just want to say, in terms of censorship, I perhaps have been to, with this film, as well with the next film that we did on the question of discourse on terrorism, but with this film, I think I have been to more than 150 shows, and my colleagues have been to many as well, and I've never encountered even a super angry audience member who doesn't agree with us at all. It just wasn't the case. We had questions, we had some critiques, but there was I didn't experience any censorship. The only censorship we may have experienced is that some of the Netflix DVDs would be scratched purposefully, because when it was on Netflix, this would happen. But that's not really much.
Some of them don't remember that Netflix.
Okay, for the people who are under 60 here, Netflix used to actually be on DVDs. So you would
shipped by mail.
They would mail. This is the box outside your house. We have a couple of questions from the audience, but we also have Omar and Rochelle and 16 other people. So we'll start with Omar because he's been waiting and he's from Iraq.
Thank you for this. I have not ever seen the film, and so special to be able to watch it for the first time here in this place and with you. Incredible. Incredible the ways in which all of these different views are capturing a moment of July, if I'm correct, July 2003. But the ways in which most of those views stand the test of time, right? It wasn't simply just that moment. It was the ways in which these narratives and the different kinds of, I wouldn't say agendas, but viewpoints have shaped how people kind of think about their experiences over these last 2 decades. And most, stand the test of time, except perhaps the Chamber of Commerce man, who, by the way, they haven't changed. I mean, the lies that come from that place continue. Maybe tons of questions, maybe 2 quick ones. One to Susie, because you mentioned you don't speak the language. So how did you, and you were behind the camera, as it's like most of the time, how did you think through that experience as you're trying to capture, asking you to go back a few years to think through it, what that was like, not speaking the language and yet still trying to capture some of the essence of what you were trying to film? And Sinan, the second haircut I liked of the 2, just for the record. And I think more than the one you have now, it's still honest. But what was that, was the idea that you were going to go back for a visit, and then the idea of the film kind of came out of that, and why only 2 weeks? You filmed for 2 weeks, is that right? Why only 2 weeks? Why not longer? Why not? Just kind of curious. Thank you again.
I think we're starting to enjoy
Hi. I thought this film was very moving, especially with the influence on people's stories rather than kind of a holistic view. I thought that was very moving. I kind of had a question about the difference between a lot of the people using dialect and using Fusha versus using dialect. I thought it was really interesting to kind of pick up on the differences, especially like taking Arabic at Georgetown, but then also versus speaking it like at home, or speaking Iraqi at home, like how like kind of this influenced like the stories that were brought up.
Thank you so much. I just echo everyone else's sentiments of gratitude. My family left Iraq in the 1990s and, never really went back. So I'm curious if you received any perspectives from the Iraqis living in July 2003 about how they felt towards the Iraqis who had left, those who kind of, just were looking on during the Iraq War, and not in any bad way, but also there were Iraqis that I know living in America who supported the war. Mm-hmm. And do you think any of that came through when you were filming? And I'm just curious about the perspectives of the Iraqis living there. Thank you.
And Rochelle.
Thank you so much. It's really amazing to be here with all of you as well, kind of going back 20 years from when you made this film. I think the first time I saw it was when Sinan came to Stanford, where I was teaching at the time, was it in 2004? Mm-hmm. And showed the film and spoke to a packed audience. So I saw it a few times after that, but this is really, for me, 18 years or 17 years later, watching this film, and I was struck, like Omar was, by how well it sort of stood the test of time, and how you can still one, it's beautifully edited, and I don't know why PBS said it was, jumpy, because it's, your intro about why, the chaos and the film is going to keep that, really, I think they didn't have a very strong vision of what film could bring. But anyway, I was really struck by, Adam, you said how much Iraqis wanted to speak to you. And I mean, you all kind of said that. You just rolled in and people just wanted to talk. And I was struck by how all of these Iraqi views that come out in this film were just steamrolled out of existence. Not in your film, but just in general. I mean, they just never made it anywhere where anyone could hear them. And yet, what you show in this film is how complex they were. They were not simple. They were very deeply enmeshed and understood, and they say over and over again, we really understand what's going on, and people kind of need to listen to us because we can make this empire move succeed, or we can make it fail. And it just was, so I don't know if you can sort of reflect on that, looking over the last 20 years on that kind of issue, on that kind of idea.
All right.
Susie, you want to go?
Oh, sure.
Just one more question.
Yes, sir.
Oh, of course.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting movie, and what strikes me in this movie in particular is how you film it in different parts of Iraq with different, probably, I don't like to use that word, but with different sectarian or religious concentrations. And you see that across the spectrum, you find the different perspectives of the people, regardless of what sect of religion they believe in. So one would assume that the fall of Saddam Hussein has made more Shias happy with that removal and more supportive of the occupation, but your movie actually shows the opposite, that they are very aware of their environment, that they have a strong national identity regardless, that they care about their country. So my question is, and I know there is no version or there is no continuation of the movie beyond the 3 months that were filmed there, but if you're looking at Iraq with all the developments that it has gone through, would you see that there's a continuation of this trend right now? Maybe in the social protests that have been taking place? Or you think that this might have changed with all the events that the country have passed through over the past 20 years. Thank you.
Susie, go ahead.
Okay. Back to that original question about me not knowing the language. I mean, I'd filmed actually a lot in Palestine and Lebanon. I'd been around and was used to sort of filming and not totally understanding what was going on. But the camera for me was also a protection, right? I could roll in, I could get out of the car, no one was gonna question me because I had this pretty big camera, and people wanted to talk, so I was the person they would come to in front of, right? And I was able to hide behind it, and you could still read the emotions on people's faces. So although I wouldn't know till later the details of what people were saying, and of course we would get back in the car and everybody would sort of tell me, but you get the feeling, you see what's going on, you see the destruction, you see the occupation, the soldiers, you see everything. So visually, I knew what to concentrate on, not just when people were talking about our environment. But it was a unique experience, and I wish that I knew at the time, of course. Now I feel like a lot of them, I can sort of recite in my head because we edited and worked on the film for so long, and I remember a lot of it, but yes, of course, it would have been better. What's the next question?
I'm trying to think. In terms of what's standing the test of time and if there's continuity, I would say that the wave of protests that occurred, particularly led by the youth a couple of years ago, in some ways is a reverberation, an echo of this in a lot of ways. It was a rejection of pretty much all the trends that were going on in Iraq at the time and that are still going on, whether it's sectarianism, whether it's corruption, whether it's the power play between the United States and Iran and other actors in Iraq. It was like Iraq for Iraqis. And in a sense, this kind of core identity of being Iraqi and having an idea of what the country should be for Iraqis is something that stood the test of time and is a testament to the people and to their desire for what I would say is really true freedom, because that would be the best way to that would be the way to experience, to realize that. And I think what we've seen is that every actor, that every stakeholder that is seeking power in Iraq has organized to try to destroy any of these kinds of movements that have emerged out of their own self-interests, and more often than not, the United States has played a role to ensure that those things get crushed. And I think that is, that's kind of the only thing that the occupier knows how to do, is crush. I just want to also point out, and that nobody asked this question, but it was really important to us, to Sinan especially, to depict in the film the cultural vibrancy of this country. And we did that mainly through the music and having the B-roll footage. But just this, that was part of pushing back against how people in this country talked about and thought of Iraq, from the highest policymakers to the soldiers who came in and everything, to demonstrate that this, of course it has an ancient history, but it also has a contemporary intellectual and cultural vibrancy that survived the devastation of Saddam, that survived the devastation of sanctions and war, and was still trying to make it happen. I mean, we showed the musical group, but we didn't show the theater. You could see the theaters a little bit that are destroyed. We didn't specify as well as maybe we should have. But even the library, the fact that people were so devastated by the destruction of the library, that was one of the first places we went, in fact. I think was so critical to include in presenting this picture and complicating things, how people think about Iraq. I'll just finally say, in terms of pushback on the film, the pushback I got was mainly from Palestinians and other Arab nationalists. I don't know what to call them, but I did get, even in my own family, I had people pushing back that we were presenting a picture of Saddam that was unfair. I'll just leave it there.
I mean, just to comment on that, I think it's a global problem in how anti-imperialists sometimes, in their efforts to resist imperialist projects, end up being uncritical of various dictators. But I just wanted to say that, sadly, I mean, the primary reason why we had to make this documentary is that we were so frustrated by how impoverished the representation of Iraq's history and of Iraqis was in the US media. That Iraqis are a monolith, they're either all Saddam supporters or US. So sadly, our task was very simple, is to show Iraqis as multidimensional human beings that actually come from different classes and different backgrounds. And following me was the idea, because it's an organizing principle, but we chose also places that speak to Iraq's history and the US involvement. So the monument of the Martyrs Monument, because that would allow us to talk about the Iraq-Iran war, but also US involvement. And we made sure to go to different areas that reflect different classes also. So we went to Athara, later called Sadr City, and we went to Shara al-Sadoun, a lot of public places. We tried to go to film where Ahmed Chalabi had set up camp, but we were his guards stopped us from filming. So, and of course we had a lot of footage that we couldn't include. And you mentioned, they were going to actually be killed on the road to the jail. We stopped to cross the street to take a picture of and then when I turned back, they were all on their knees, and there were American soldiers pointing guns at them. Simply because we were in a white GMC, and 2 days before, a white GMC had attacked an American unit, so they thought that all people who are going to attack the US Army will use white GMCs. And then someone said, we have a US passport, and that's it. So just the precarity, and we were lucky. But I wanted to say that, yes, diasporas usually also reflect the home country. Yes, there were people who were wary of us because, the system that the US put in place also gave diaspora Iraqis a bad name. And I remember we went somewhere to film, and someone said, you're one of those Iraqis who are just coming to exploit us. And I told him, look, we're here to make a film about you, not to exploit you. So you can say whatever you want. And of course, he flipped, and he's like, no, welcome, blah, 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 and all of that. But there was pushback when we showed the film here in DC, because Iraqi Americans had also internalized and started to shift in their identities. So we were attacked by people on the right and on the left, and this and that. And yes, there was a place that there were people who are uncomfortable with focusing on the crimes of dictatorship. But I'm proud to say that the main thing about our film is that it's not going to be only about US occupation, because it's more complicated, and we have to also give voice to the victims of dictatorship, who for the longest time, by the way, were not even the subject of US media. Just like with Syria, for the longest time, Syrian victimhood became a subject only when it was weaponized by US foreign policy. So, and the second haircut, because the first haircut was in Amman, the second haircut was in Shara al-Sadoun. That's why it's better.
I'll just comment on the spaces and the places that we went to. And this might sound like we're trying to be, I don't know, too academic, but the fact is that this film is distinguished by the fact that we were studying the Middle East very closely. And at the time, actually, the semester before or the year before we filmed, I was teaching a course next door here at Georgetown University titled The Politics of Syria and Iraq. And Sinan, of course, his knowledge about Iraq is encyclopedic. And when this was hatched many months before, we were aware of the arguments that exist that are problematic or sectarian, or aware of the blind spots. So it does look like we went everywhere, but this was somewhat methodical, and the questions were also aimed to address things that would either affirm or revise some of our thinking on this. So it did have a long shelf life, in part because we were approaching this from an analytical point of view as well. So and I'm glad that it did, because from all the experiences that I've had with people who have shown it, especially in classrooms, they actually end up showing it again, and that's something that makes us very content.
Can I add a brief thing?
You can add a brief thing. We have 2 more questions after you add a brief thing, and then we'll take a last round, and then we'll release you all.
Just about my family home and our street, and I've written about this, not just because it was my family home, but because the street itself was a microcosm of Iraq. It had Kurdish families, it has Shias, and it has Sunnis. Just talking to the neighbors was convenient. And once again, this was a very dangerous and precarious time. So we went to the places that we knew, but the street itself, despite what you may think, and the whole, speaking of terminology, this notion of mixed neighborhoods, most neighborhoods were mixed neighborhoods. There was no such thing as mixed neighborhood before 2003. It wasn't a common term.
Let me just share the questions from online, and then is there anyone here who wants to ask a question? Okay, so the 2 questions are, one for Sinan. Thank you very much for this excellent documentary. A question for Sinan. That was in the text. I'm not just repeating myself. How did you deal with the comment made by Iraqis, including by this one, especially one Iraqi, which is the cab driver? If you've been here the whole time, you would ... And the question for all of us is, what do you think of literary and cinematographic accounts of Iraq veterans, like the Yellowbirds and American Sniper, etc.? So you want to address?
I want to say briefly, I have always found cab drivers to be the most interesting interlocutors. When I lived in Iraq, that was one of the few spaces where actually people, because it's a temporary encounter, would say things that they wouldn't say. But yes, I understand what the cab driver is saying. In 1991, when the U.S. started bombing Iraq initially, for the first few hours, I thought, okay, this will humiliate Saddam. But then I thought, but this is going to destroy the country. I completely understand how the cab driver would feel. But that's why we had this argument with him. And we were genuine. And as Bassam said, we showed the spectrum of opinions that we didn't agree with. That's the whole purpose of the film, is to show that there is no monolith of Iraqis. They think differently because they're human beings.
I never thought, Sinan, you'd have anything in common with Thomas Friedman, because he also appreciates conversations with cab drivers.
Except he doesn't understand the language they speak.
No, except that he only focuses on...
Just on that scene, I think that's probably one of the more important scenes that we have in the film, because not just because of what's said, but also the way. And you don't see filmmakers do this, and I'm not saying that we deserve credit for it, but this guy flipped it on us completely. He became the interrogator. and yeah, I mean, we showed the whole thing. It was great. I'll say one thing. I don't think I ever told you this, Sinan, but when we were driving, this was one of the biggest lessons I learned about working with people who've experienced trauma. And I had already been in Palestine for a couple of years and had been traumatized myself from that experience. But when we were driving one day, and I think it was coming out of his neighborhood, so we spent a lot of time, or some time at Sinan's aunt's house, where we met his family and others. And we were leaving there and going, I don't remember where, but as we were driving, Sinan started chanting, humming, singing a song about Saddam, praising Saddam from his youth. And I think he, at least the way I saw that happening at that moment, he sort of caught himself and then realized what he was doing, that it was spontaneous. It wasn't him, as sometimes he does, making fun or exploiting, the moment, but it kind of seeped up from his unconsciousness into his conscious. And we didn't really, I think, we laughed it off at that moment, but it really made me, and I've known Sinan for a few years by then, mainly in this context here at Georgetown. But seeing that this trauma is so deep, that that Sinan talking about the effects of living under dictatorship. It's a nice term to talk about academically and whatnot, but to see it and as it came forward and surfaced, as we were riding around these streets where Sinan had grown up, for me was one of the biggest lessons of my life to experience that and realize like how this operates, even amongst people who you don't know from that context and who think, I mean, as you all can hear Sinan speak, he's incredibly brilliant, but he has had this experience, and that isn't something that goes away either. And that's what I think about often when I think about Iraqis or Afghans or other oppressed peoples, is that this idea that you can rebuild a society or start something new overnight without somehow addressing the trauma and that, you know, a country like the United States can come in and try to reset the table or whatever is the most obscene hubris and is of course criminal.
Yeah, you know, I work now as a social worker, and I work with people who've been wrongfully convicted and exonerated and have been in prison for decades. So I am like the first point of support for them when they come out now. And when I was watching this movie back and what you're saying now, it's so similar in terms of processing the trauma. And like I said, when they came to us and wanted to speak to us, and where we left them and where they are now and how much the trauma has been compounded, it's unfathomable. And there is a guilt that I feel, having gone there, filmed it, left, come back, 20 years later we have this retrospect, and there's still people obviously suffering. And like I mentioned before, I wonder what, if any, space was allowed to process even that trauma of the occupation, of staying, and of the continuous trauma that people unfortunately have lived through. And yes, I actually remember that when he was singing and he was telling us about growing up, and I actually remember you talking about yourself as a schoolboy, and it was this moment where we're both, he's the subject and the filmmaker at the same time. It's a unique position for him to be in, and I think that's why it was so powerful, and that's why that scene with the cab driver worked, because of the sort of rawness of Sinan and Bassam, especially when they're together. If you know them, they work off each other, and that cabbie held his own, right? He was able to sort of to hold his own in that space, which was hard. And but they always, and all of us, but especially them, offered respect, and I think that was received and given back. And that was probably what's different than the other documentaries that may have been made. I haven't seen some of the ones that someone mentioned, online, but I think that is a key difference.
Amr, do you have a very quick question? Okay, so that'll be the last question, then we're going to break, unless somebody's. Okay.
Just a comment and question. It's interesting that in the early days.
One second.
Yeah. In the early days of the occupation, people were telling you that anyone who's coming from abroad does not know our experiences from here. And 20 years on, this prime minister is the first, not to endorse, but is the first prime minister from Al-Dakhil. All of them up until this point have been from abroad. The questions to Bassam, which I wanted to ask you, is, you have this wonderful piece from a few years ago in The Nation, grappling with the competing narratives of Syria. And so the question I have is, to what extent, or, and not kind of in an academic way, but in a kind of visceral, emotional way from your experiences making this film, how these competing narratives and opinions from inside Iraq after 2003 kind of influenced your thinking around the competing narratives around the Syrian situation, and how you kind of thought about these different viewpoints vis-a-vis the war in Syria.
I mean, this is the $1 million question. We have a whole project, as I shared, to address this. It's not easy, and it's different in every case, but it's also very similar. In Iran, so many of us, whether Iranian or not, are opposed to the policies of the domestic policy of the Iranian regime, but we are also opposed to the U.S. sanctions on Iran because they end up harming civilians, and that becomes a very difficult situation to be in. Same thing with the question of Iraq, except that there is like a full-fledged invasion of Iraq by the United States, so it's easier to oppose that, especially on the ground that the gentleman. By the way, I wrote down what you said earlier, sir, and I will put it in my house. You said to invade Iraq on baloney pretenses. I love this statement. It's one. So, and therefore, it is easier to critique. In the case of Syria, we have a very similar dynamic with the obvious opposition, moral and otherwise, to the Syrian regime and its brutality, especially in how it dealt with the early weeks and months of the uprising, but also the fact that so many actors and states descended on Syria for the express purpose of preserving or furthering their own interests at the expense of the Syrian people and at the expense ultimately of the Syrian opposition, which ended up harming the opposition and allowed for this outcome that we have now, in which we are neither here nor there, with a return to a decrepit and still a very repressive regime. So there's we're working on developing not answers but more questions. It is a very interesting dynamic which you and I and everyone here will end up experiencing more and more in the future, given that we used to talk in the past about the question of imperialism and authoritarianism and how we need to oppose both, which is a cop-out. Of course, we need to oppose both, but how? When they are actually in one particular context. But in the future, I think the idea of imperialism being just connected to the West, and it's not that it ever only was connected to the West, but more pointedly, in the future, we are looking at other rising superpowers, notably China and so on. So this question will be that much more difficult, especially that a lot of people in the region, for instance, are looking to the rise of China, not as a savior and as the purveyor of new democracies, but as something to balance the somewhat singular influence in the region of the United States and most of what is called, quote unquote, the West. So this is the million-dollar question, and there are no answers. It depends on the context, and it depends on the dynamics of the context. And no matter what you do, like in the Syrian case, in the Iran case today, in the Iraq case, then you're going to be accused either of being a sympathizer with dictatorship, which we and most people that are accused are not, or somebody who just supports external imperialism, which, again, a lot of people that are accused of this are not, but they're simply in this very tough situation, especially locals. Locals, like the taxi driver and others, might seem that they are pro-imperialist, but they're not. These people, everybody is faced with quote unquote, I don't use this language, but evil options. And when they go for the lesser evil, then they're pigeonholed. And there must be a better way to deal with this discursively, and this is something we're trying to find vocabulary for. Wassalamu alaikum.
Well, maybe one last lighter note. We don't know, maybe Sinan does, but we don't know about the people we met in the film, most of them. But Amr Tawfiq, who sang for us, a few years ago, he appeared on Arab Idol, which was somewhat shocking. And he delivered an incredible performance. You could actually find it on YouTube. And he brought everybody to tears. And I cried watching it also. Like it was really something. And it was amazing to see him perform it.
But sadly, he died last year.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
So you just ruined
and apropos of all of this, thanks. Let me just say a couple of logistical things about what we are doing with this project going forward. This project will survive online in a portal under the title theinvasionofiraq.com. There you will find links to everything that happened today. You'll find links to the film, which will be released officially in open source format on YouTube on April 10th, when all of us will be having an event in which we launch the film. You will also find a number of pedagogic resources along the lines of what we do at the Arab Studies Institute with the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative, where we provide a curated and potentially annotated list of books, peer-reviewed articles, and various roundtables, book reviews that can be used by educators and researchers and students, journalists alike. And we already have on Jadaliyya, for those interested, that it's already published, a list of book reviews on Iraq, which will be complemented by another in the next week. All of this material will be really quite helpful. Feel free to join or visit the website sometime in late April. I will leave the last words to our Sheikh, Professor Joseph Sassoon.
Thank you very much. To the panel. Thank you to all the people who attended. Thank you to all the panelists, whether in person or in virtual. I hope one day we'll have a conference on Iraq with happy things only and not about invasion and occupation and tortures. I think it was a great conference. Thank you very much for the two people who really made it possible, Daniel Derani and Coco Tate, and to Enya and Geraldine who took very good care of us. I think it was really Fogan Nachal. Thank you all for coming, and to the next one.
Thank you, Joseph.